Instead of writing a bunch of manual YAML in Home Assistant to integrate your MQTT device, did you know that you can simply publish a couple of special messages from your device to have it automatically integrate and appear in Home Assistant, much like native integrations? I'll show you how to structure and publish these messages using MQTT Discovery to create individual entities or even entire devices with multiple entities in Home Assistant without any manual configuration required on the Home Assistant side. And not a single line of YAML will be needed. Hi, and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. In my last video, I showed how to add MQTT devices to Home Assistant manually via YAML. But if you are adding MQTT to your own DIY devices, there's a way to have your devices automatically discovered and integrated into Home Assistant without writing a single line of YAML. This can be especially helpful if you're publishing your project or your code for others to use. I know from my own projects that most of the time people tend to struggle with getting the MQTT entities created in Home Assistant. But by adding Home Assistant MQTT Discovery to my project, my devices just automatically appear in Home Assistant without the end user needing to write any YAML whatsoever. It's very much like a native integration. And what's more, I don't need to rely on any APIs or tokens or anything like that to make this work. I just need to publish a couple of special MQTT messages from my device. Now, all the normal caveats are going to apply here, including having an MQTT broker, having the Home Assistant MQTT add-on enabled and configured, and having Discovery turned on in that add-on. Now, this video is not going to be about how to add MQTT to your devices. If you want to know more about that, I do have another video that covers the basics of how to add MQTT to your DIY devices, and you can also find a link to that down in the video description. And while I'll be showing some sample Arduino code along the way, note that this works with pretty much any language such as Python or Java or .NET. Anything that can publish and receive MQTT messages will work in exactly the same way. And as always, there'll be a related blog article, which you can find a link to in the video description as well, that will contain more code samples, including a full gist file of much of what I show today. With that, let's take a look at the topic and payloads needed for MQTT Discovery in Home Assistant. So the discovery topic for Home Assistant MQTT Discovery is actually quite simple. It starts out with the base of Home Assistant. That is the default discovery topic base, and it can be changed in your MQTT integration, but that's the default and most people won't have changed it. We follow that with the domain or the type of entity we'll want to create, like a switch or a sensor or a light. Then an object ID. Now this must be unique across all of your different entities. And I'll talk a little bit more about creating a unique ID in a second. And then finally followed with a config. That's all there is to creating our discovery topic. Here are a few examples of creating a switch, a light, and a sensor. So again, it's Home Assistant, the domain type, then a unique identifier or a unique object ID followed by config. That's all there is to it. Now, do note that you can add additional nodes in there if you want. Home Assistant isn't going to use those for anything, but if you need to add additional nodes like here, my group, you can add that between the domain type and the config. Notice that you still need a unique object ID. Again, if you're doing something like this on Arduino, it's very simple. All you need to do is publish your MQTT topic with the configuration payload. So what does the configuration payload look like? Well, the discovery payload must be a serialized JSON format, and really it is laid out exactly like a YAML configuration would be if we were to add an MQTT entity in YAML on the Home Assistant side, which is exactly what I showed in the previous video. So in this case would be a simple example of adding an MQTT sensor in Home Assistant via YAML. We're going to give it a name, a unique ID, which I'll talk about again in a minute, state topic, unit of measure, availability, all the other types of things that we would add here in YAML. We want to basically create a JSON payload that matches that. So over here on the JSON side, we have the same key value pairs as we would have in YAML. So it's laid out exactly the same. Once we have that JSON payload, we can simply publish it. Again, the Arduino example, in this case, we would have something like a JSON document. We would add each of these key value pairs to that document, serialize that into a buffer, and then publish our discovery topic and the payload. Now do note here I have a true at the end. That is for the retained flag. I want this discovery message to be retained on the broker. There are other ways to do that. You can not retain it, and then you can publish or subscribe to a message from Home Assistant when Home Assistant restarts. I won't get into a lot of that here. You can look at the official documentation. I'm going to publish all of my discovery statements with retained flags set to true. So as easy as it is to add an entity through discovery, it's also just as easy to delete or remove one. We can remove any of our discovered entities by simply publishing an empty payload to the original discovery topic. So if we created our entity by publishing this topic, then all we have to do to actually remove that or delete it back out of Home Assistant is to publish to the same exact topic, but with an empty payload. Now in this case, I'm also not using the retained flag, so that will actually also remove the original discovery message from the MQTT broker as well. But do note that your topics have to match exactly for this to work. In this method, you can add, remove the same entity, and it won't create duplicates in Home Assistant. And we'll see why this is an important concept next. One thing about MQTT discovered entities, it happens instantaneously once that message is published. There is no interaction on the end user's part, it just shows up in Home Assistant. So there may be situations where the end user may not want your device to be discovered and created automatically. Maybe they want to do it manually, or maybe it's going to cause a conflict with some existing entity names, something along the way. So you really want to provide some way for the user to be able to enable and in turn disable and remove any discovered entities. So here are my few recommendations. First, default MQTT discovery to false in your code. So by default, it's turned off. Nothing's going to automatically be created in Home Assistant. But then provide some kind of setting or option or some other kind of method to allow the end user to turn discovery on so that your entities can be discovered and integrated into Home Assistant. There are a lot of different ways to do that. Maybe you've got an options or configuration page. You could do something like a simple HTTP post, which is what I'm going to show. You could subscribe to an MQTT message and have something published to MQTT, and there are other ways. But the idea here is to allow some way for the end user to have some control over enabling and disabling MQTT discovery for your device or your project. So let's take a look at a simple example of just publishing a single entity to Home Assistant. This is what I'm going to use. I'm going to use this topic of creating a sensor. I've given it just a random object ID at this point with our config for our topic, and I'm going to use this payload. Again, it's a simple temperature sensor, give it a unique ID, a state topic, and a unit of measure. That's all I'm going to give it just to see what gets created over on the Home Assistant side. This is what it again looks like in Arduino. I'm going to take that payload, serialize it, and then I'm going to publish this MQTT message. And I actually have discovery turned off by default, but this is how I will turn discovery on and turn it back off again. Do note, I'm just running some sample code on a Wemos D1 Mini here. There actually isn't even a temperature sensor connected. It really just has Wi-Fi and MQTT. And I'm going to publish these messages just to see how it works in Home Assistant. MQTT discovery is currently turned off on the device. And if we come over to Home Assistant and we check our entities, we see we have no entity with MQTT in the name. So I'm going to issue a simple HTTP command here to turn discovery on the device. Okay, discovery was turned on, and it should have published that MQTT message to Home Assistant. Now, if we come back and we take a look at our developer tools, there we see our temperature sensor. So it came in automatically, popped into Home Assistant. The end user didn't have to do anything, did not have to write any YAML. It just showed up in Home Assistant. Now, a couple other items to note here. There was already an MQTT value for temperature that was published by the device. If the state had not been published yet, that would be listed as unknown until a state was published. Another point though here is there was no prompt to the end user to add it. It just happened automatically. But the good news is because we did include a unique ID, we do have the ability to come in here and change the name of the entity ID. So it's always good to include that unique ID to give the end user the opportunity to rename any entities that are created by MQTT discovery. Now, what happens if we turn discovery back off again? Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to turn discovery off, and notice what it did. It published a message, and it removed the entities directly out of Home Assistant that it created before. So it's a nice way to give your end users an option to turn Discovery on to create the entities and then turn Discovery back off if they want to remove them. Now, I've mentioned the importance of unique IDs a few times. One of the main reasons for making sure that you use the unique ID with every entity is it allows the user to make changes to things like the entity name in Home Assistant. If you've ever tried to edit an entity in Home Assistant that didn't have a unique ID, you've probably run into a message like this. Again, without a unique ID, nothing on the Home Assistant side, from the entity name to unit of measure or anything else, can be changed. That's why it's important to always include a unique ID in your Discovery payload for each entity. Now, when it comes to creating these unique IDs, of course, you can always hard code a unique ID as long as your device or project is only going to be installed one time in Home Assistant. But even when you do use hard-coded values, remember that each topic and any kind of unique ID you use for each entity must be unique and different from all others. For example, if I were to try to publish two sensors here with the same topic, that's not going to work. When I publish the second sensor, it's actually just going to update the configuration of the first one since they have the same topic. Instead, what you need to do is you need to differentiate between those two. Again, in this case, I just tagged a 1 and a 2 to the object or entity ID. Now, the other problem is with using hard-coded topics is you can't install multiple copies of that device. So let's say I've created some kind of wonderful multi-sensor and someone wants to create two of them in their home. Well, they install the first one, but when they go to install and configure the second one, it's trying to use the same exact topics and the same exact unique IDs, which isn't going to work. I discovered this the hard way when someone reached out to me about my LED parking assistant. It had never occurred to me that someone might install more than one of those in their home, but guess what? Both of them had the same exact MQTT topics, so that didn't work. So your best option, if at all possible, for unique IDs is to use something like the device's MAC address to create a unique identifier that can be used for topics and entity unique IDs based on that particular device. So for example, if I have some kind of hard-coded device prefix, but then I get some portion of the MAC address, which is, again, easy to do in something like Arduino, I can now combine those to create a unique device ID, and that's going to be unique to just this device. So then I can take that and I can use that to create unique identifiers for both my topics and the unique ID for each entity. And again, if you want to see an example of how I did this, check down in the video description. There'll be a link to a file where I show how I did all this with Arduino. So up to now, we've created individual entities to publish to Home Assistant. If my device has, say, 4 or 5 different entities, I could publish each of those and they would all come into Home Assistant, but they'd be standalone entities and they would not be related together. It is very easy and possible, however, to create a device in Home Assistant and take all of those entities and group them together. In addition, we can also provide some additional information about our device. We can do all this very easily just by making a slight change in the payload that we send with our Discovery topic. To make this work, all we have to do is add a device nested object to that JSON payload. So if we have an initial entity payload that looks something like this, say this is a sensor, it's power, unique ID, or state topic, all we have to do is add a device nested object in here. And the only thing that's really required for that is name and identifiers. All the rest of this stuff is optional, and I'll show you where this appears in the device in Home Assistant in a minute. Do note that identifiers can be an array, so you can technically have an entity be a member of multiple devices. We're not going to look at that here. We're just going to use a single identifier, but we only need to include this with the first entity that we publish. All other entities only need to have a matching name and a matching identifier to be grouped together underneath that device in Home Assistant. And here you can see where some of that information shows up on the device page in Home Assistant. Now, it's not required to include this other information. If you don't include it in your payload, it just simply won't show up on the device page. There's one other thing to note here. Most of these keys in your key value pairs for your JSON accept abbreviations. And the reason why this is important is these payloads can actually get pretty big, and that means your message size is going to get pretty big. Now, MQTT itself, the specification in most brokers will allow a message size of up to 256 megabytes. But as I discovered, and if you're using Arduino, note that the pub/sub library defaults to only having a maximum message size of only 256 bytes. It took me a while, which you're going to see in just a second, to figure out why some of my payloads or my messages were being delivered and others weren't. But do note that you can easily increase the size of those messages in the pub/sub library by either editing the H file, or you can actually set a buffer size in your code. So now let's take a look at creating a Home Assistant device that has multiple entities. In my particular case, I'm going to create a single Home Assistant device that has 4 entities. It's going to have a dimmer switch, which will be a light with brightness control, a light level sensor, a temperature sensor, and an IP address. Now do note that in my code, only the light entity, the first one listed here, contains the full device info, while all the rest of them only have that name and ID. Now let's see what happens if we turn Discovery on now that we have a device defined. So I'm going to come back up here again, turn my Discovery on, and our devices should have been discovered in Home Assistant. So let's take a look. If we come over to our MQTT integration, we see we have 3 devices, and there's the My MQTT device that we just defined. Now it does say manufacturer and model unknown. I think we can fix that. If we go into this, right now we're just showing the temperature sensor. We're not seeing the switch or the light lux level. So I need to go back to my code, check that out. Obviously, I'm not formatting something in my Discovery payload right, so that information is showing up here and the entities are getting created. So I'm going to go ahead and turn Discovery back off. Again, you can see that automatically removed the device out of Home Assistant, and it is no longer there. It removed the device and the entity. I'm going back in and I've tweaked my payloads a little bit, including increasing the buffer size of the Arduino pub/sub library. But I think I have all that resolved now. So now I'm going to turn my Discovery back on, and you can see my device has popped in here. This time I do have the model number. And if I go ahead and drill into this, now you're going to see I have everything here under one device. I have my firmware version. I actually have a URL. If I have a web interface, I can allow the user to go directly to that web interface. I actually added a diagnostic down here as well. So I have my MQTT light, and you can see that it does have dimmer control in here. I have my 2 sensors, and I have, again, just a diagnostic, which happens to be the IP address of this device. All this was done without writing a single line of YAML anywhere. Instead, it came in more or less like a native integration. And just like before, if I decide I want to remove this device and all the entities associated with it, I can just turn my Discovery back off, and it removed not only the MQTT device, but also removed all of the entities out of Home Assistant as well. And a simple toggle back to on, and there they are, added back in again. Nothing gets duplicated. So it's a great way, even for your own devices, but especially for devices that you may want to share or share your code or firmware for other Home Assistant users, so they don't have to go through all that manual MQTT configuration unless they want to, which is why I always recommend that you add some sort of flag or option where the end user can enable or disable MQTT discovery in Home Assistant. There is one other item to note here. Because we included a unique ID in our Discovery payload, it means that the user can now come in here and actually change the actual entity ID. Why is this important? Well, for one, if one of your entity names gets auto-discovered and that entity name already exists in Home Assistant is going to tag a number on the end of it, 2 for the second one, 3 for the third one. But again, because we have that unique ID, we can come in here and we can change this entity ID to anything that we want. If we didn't have a unique ID in here, then you would not be able to come in and actually change the entity ID in Home Assistant. I've only scratched the surface here on the basics of using Home Assistant Discovery to add your MQTT devices. Be sure to check out the video description for more information, including the sample code that I used in this video and links to the official documentation. If you want to provide a way to share your DIY firmware and make it very easy for others to integrate your device into Home Assistant, MQTT Discovery is an easy way to make that happen. I'll be back in January with more videos on components, DIY projects, and maybe a few more Home Assistant 101 videos. Until that time, I'd like to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon.